Hi, everyone. My name is Alan Cho. I'm the Executive Director of the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop. It's a pleasure to see everyone here. This is the 30th anniversary of the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop. Sean actually reminded me it's the 50th year because the Chinese Canadian Writers Workshop and the Japanese PAL Review actually merged together 50 years ago. And a year later, the Inalienable Rice Anthology, the first ever Asian Canadian anthology, came out. So actually, it's the 50th anniversary of the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop. So we decided to call this festival Origins because we really want to go back in time in history to honor our past. But we also have recently, last year, commemorated the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Exclusion Act when it was passed in Canada. We also want to honor and acknowledge that history, the dark period of history as well. And thank you to Catherine for giving us this exhibit, but also the book as well, which she'll present today. Anyways, without further ado, I want to welcome the president of ACWW, Todd, to give a few words as well.
Hi there, everybody. Hi. My name is Todd Wong, so I'm president of Asian Canadian Writers Workshop because I've sort of been around the longest and having to help Jim Wong Chu for so long. He's really one of the founders. Roy Miki was so important as well, and also one of the first recipients of our Asian Canadian Writers Workshop Award, I think in 2003, but it was in 2002 when we first created this Asian Canadian Writers Workshop Community Builders Award. And that was awarded to Paul Yee. It was awarded to Wei-Sin Choi. And Larry Wong was one of the people on our committee that year because he was a boyhood friend with Wei-Sin. But they all agreed and they said, you know, we are really here to recognize Roy Ma. And going back, and that's what Jim would do, he'd go back into the origins of the first writers. And that's why it was important that we would also recognize Choi Kagawa. And I'm also founding president for the historic Choi Kagawa House Society because we learned how important Asian Canadian writing was to be visible. And that's why we supported the historic Choi Kagawa House to be saved at that time and turned into a writer's residence program, and that we could bring in and share with many more people. So Larry was a very important part of that. The first time I met Larry was when Jim had created the Go for Broke Review. Anybody remember that? I think back in 1994? Yes, Alan and Fana for sure. And that's when Larry presented Suya, which means late night snack. And it was a late night play. He's written so many other things. He wrote his dim sum stories. But more importantly, as a community builder, he was also a founding member of the Chinese Canadian Historical Society of BC. And they created the Larry Wong Community Prize, which, you know, we're really grateful that Rice Paper has received mention from that, and Gong Haggis Fat Choi, which we produce through Asian Canadian Writers Workshop, has been recognized. And so it's very important that Larry be recognized. And Marlene Enns, the widow of Jim Wong Chu, remembers many stories that were yelled at from upstairs between Jim and Larry. And so we know that we wanted to recognize it today, Larry's, all his contributions that he made, even as a historian for the Chinese Canadian Military Museum, to keep these stories alive as its first curator. And Larry told me, you know, Todd, I have to pass on the torch, and it's going to be my friend, Catherine Clement, who took on the role of curator. She's nodding, you know, and we know that she really holds the memories of Larry so deep. They were such good friends, and we also really wanted to recognize that this year and have that presented to Catherine. So we, Asian Canadian Writers Workshop, present our 2025 Community Builders Award to Larry Wong. And Larry is presented on top of Rice Paper Magazine. And Catherine, will you come up and receive that? Catherine has been the executor for Larry and helping to organize a lot of the memory tributes through BC, what was it, Chinese Canadian Historical Society of BC, and important. He was such a good friend, and we miss him. Thank you.
Without further ado, I want to introduce Catherine Clement. Catherine is an award-winning Canadian community historian, curator, and author. She is known for her extensive crowdsourced community history projects that help uncover, share, and preserve the experience. Extraordinary times. Her books have been extensions of her history projects. Catherine first drew acclaim for her 10-year search uncovering the hidden works of Yu Chao, Vancouver's first and most prolific Chinese photographer. At the end of that project, she published the award-winning book Chinatown Through a Wide Lens, The Hidden Photography of Yu Chao. Catherine's latest book, The Paper Trail to 1923 China's Exclusion Act, documents a monumental yet largely forgotten chapter in Canadian history. The pages of this book explore the human experience of Chinese exclusion as revealed through the stories of individuals who lived through this dark period. I'm not going to take up too much time because I know that Catherine has lots to share with us today. So I hand it over to you, Catherine. Welcome.
Thank you, everyone. I have a stopwatch here so I don't go over. It's interesting for me to find myself speaking at a LiterASIAN festival because I actually don't consider myself a writer, an author. I do it, but I'm not someone who's in love with the written word and really enjoys expression and thinking of new verbs and adjectives that I can use to tell a story. I do these books only because I want to preserve a project that often took many years to pull together. And because I want to also honor the people whose stories were shared with me. The work that I do is very much about looking at history through memory, and especially through memory of common people, ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. So I'm less interested in the stories of leaders or the stories of the rich or famous, or dates for that matter, or statistics. What I'm interested in is the human experience of something that was painful and catastrophic. And one of my heroes in this kind of work is an American journalist and author who is now gone, but his name was Studs Terkel. And he did a lot of work looking at major events in history, the Second World War, and also the Great Depression, as told through the memories of hundreds of people who were just ordinary people in different parts of, farmers, those who worked in factories, those who served overseas. And the one that I found the most interesting was one that was called Hard Times. It was about the Great Depression. And this is how he opens up the book. This has been true for all disasters. The great many were wounded in one manner or another. It left on them an invisible scar. And this will be true, as you'll see, as we look through what we found. Now, when I was finishing up the Yu Chao book, I thought, I realized that the 100th anniversary of the Exclusion Act was coming up. I have to admit, I hadn't given the Exclusion Act a lot of thought, and that's partly because when I would interview, with all the interviews that I did over the years, it seldom came up. And yet I was interviewing people that were born into this period of time. And so I was under the impression, well, it couldn't have been that bad. because otherwise, why didn't people talk about it? But I wanted to do something to honor the 100th anniversary, and I knew that out there were all these different pieces of paper that were sort of the debris, the archival debris of this particular period of time. So just like with Yu Cho Chow, I thought I was going to go out and crowdsource these from across Canada. I would work to create an archival collection. I would gather the stories of the people and what they went through, and then I would do an exhibition, and finally I would do a book. So a lot of pieces of work. But what was interesting when we started on this journey, and we would ask people, sometimes people say, well, I don't think we have one of those, or these were Chinese Canadians across the country. Others would say, oh, geez, we threw that out. Or they would hand it to me and they said, well, we almost threw this out. They told me how they found these things in Zeller bags and in the back of sock drawers and all these things. And when they passed it on to me, and I would ask them, well, what can you tell me about what happened to this relative of yours, your father, your grandfather, grandmother, during the Exclusion Act? Resoundingly, I was met with silence. Usually people would say, well, is that the same thing as the head tax? Or, no, my father never spoke about this. My mother never spoke about this. It was a story that was shrouded in silence. And I thought, how am I really going to get at what happened? And if this 100th anniversary is coming up, we have this one chance to pull back the veil and really understand what was the lived experience of exclusion. Not the big, broad, brush strokes of what exclusion was. It was a law and it came in 1923, but the lived experience. So it was clear it was going to be a much harder project. And I'm very fortunate that I approached UBC History Department and Dr. Henry Yu in particular, and he gave me a few students who would work with me. And it turned into really an excavation project. So it involved hundreds of hours of reviewing English newspapers and Chinese newspapers from that period of time, looking for small stories in those papers that gave us a glimpse of what happened. It was also looking through coroner's reports and trial records and letters and items that we could find in the clan societies from their scrapbooks. It was also getting the government to release all the documents related to the Exclusion Act called CI-44s, which were forms filled out on every Chinese person at the time, and which had been kept basically under lock and key in Library and Archives Canada for 100 years. And yet we're a snapshot of a community just before it descended into its darkest hours. And we also, whatever breadcrumbs of stories families could tell us, oh, I remember my grandfather telling me, who lived in Moose Jaw, that people wore this button, the whites wore a button that said purely English. Or I remember my father saying that he had to sit at the back of movie theaters, at the back of the bus. Couldn't swim in the public pools. And when they did, the pools were drained afterwards. So just these little, as I said, breadcrumbs of memories. And all of those together form what you see in this book. It formed the exhibition, part of the exhibition, but also in addition to that, what happened was more certificates came in, more stories came in, and all together, this is what's informing what we're going to talk about in this book. It was a tough book to write, partly because, when we do an exhibition or anything I've done in the past, I'm interested in what I do, and I learn something every time I work on a project. But this project was different because it fundamentally changed how I understood something, fundamentally changed me as a person. And what I found is that it had the same effect on quite a few other people. It was like waking up after a long slumber of indifference. So the book that you have, a lot of you have in your hands, actually consists of 7 chapters. And the first chapter is, I really just do a little bit of the background, how I came across this, my first introduction to the Exclusion Act, which I didn't even realize it. All of my work to date, whether it be Yucho Chow or anything before that, all relates to the time I spent interviewing and befriending World War II veterans and seeing their documents and seeing their pictures and hearing them tell me things. So that's the first chapter. The second chapter, which is similar to what we had in the exhibition but goes a lot broader and deeper, really looks at the arrival of what our community called the Cruelty Act. And it's worth noting the words they use, because it's trying to describe something to us. The act officially is the Chinese Immigration Act 1923, but it doesn't mean anything. It's actually, initially, it was called the Cruelty Act. And so I'm not going to go into that in a lot of detail here, because some of you already know it, but I just, I keep, in here we look at basically the 2 fights. So the first fight was against the act itself. And, you know, these are some of the, as the act's coming in and the debates are going on, we look at and include some of the newspapers that the Chinese community is reading at that time. You know, Chinese immigrants in Canada, you know, to be registered and fingerprints taken. And you have to remember at that time, fingerprints were only used for criminals. So there's this sense in the community, well, why are you treating us like criminals? What is it about us that we are being targeted? We look at how the community rallied to try to actually change the act, to stop the act, first of all, and to change the act. And then what happened when they actually reached the Senate. And this is a brief quote. So they sent a delegation to the Senate because that was the last place where they could get it changed. And this newspaper article reads, each member of the upper chamber has received a copy of the voluminous petition on behalf of the Chinese Association of Canada. It is a document of 18 foolscap pages and is so voluminous that the majority of the recipients discarded it without perusal. Couldn't even be bothered to look at it. And I imagine how soul-crushing that must have been. And of course, again, as you all know, the act comes in Canada Day, July 1923. An important day afterwards is this date for the registration. Everybody must register, no matter who you are. A lot of people had to report to RCMP offices to register. So then another fight happens, which is a fight against the actual registration. So this is like 2 years of going into battle. And these, again, are some of the headlines that they're reading. RCMP to round up Chinese for registration and photos. And it just gives you an idea of how people are feeling. They're bitter, they're angry, they're launching different protests. They fight to the very end. There's some that are fighting to the very end. And even one fellow here in Vancouver, David Liu, says, well, I'm not going to register. And he didn't. And he's basically said, let them take me to court. I'm a naturalized Canadian. And of course, one of the biggest issues was the registration of all Canadian-born children. So anyway, this is just, and in 1924, you find, when I did Yucho Chow, I found all these photos from 1923 and 1924, and this is the Yip family, this is Selena's grandfather. And then from there, the first the CI-45, which is the first piece that is given to an immigration card given to Canadian-born Chinese. So, Department of Immigration, this certificate does not establish legal status in Canada. Here's the numbers of what, so keep this in mind, because we'll bring it up again later. Adult males, 48,426. Adult females, only 1,350 in all of Canada, and then children under 18. And this law goes on for a quarter century and has followed the decades of head taxes and increasing restrictions on Chinese. So that's the backstory. But again, it's just, it's outrageous, but at the same time, it is what it is. So chapter 3 takes it right down to the real human level. And this is where I'm deeply indebted to the hundreds of families across Canada who submitted stories and certificates and had to dig them up to find them, and who offer us an opportunity to really understand what happened to people. And this chapter is divided into 2 sections. The first section is called The Defeated. And these are mostly stories that we found quite by accident. We found them in a newspaper, or we found something in the government release documents that led us on a journey to follow someone's paper trail to see what happened to them. But these were the ones who have been forgotten and who's really suffered the most pain from the Exclusion Act. We found a lot of men who left. Canada was the first thing, and one of them says, I've lived overseas for several decades, rootless and drifting. Now I'm almost 70 years old, struggling with sickness, poverty, hunger, and homelessness. And then he thanks everybody for financing his trip home. But I think it's interesting, rootless and drifting. And we heard other words like living for decades in places where I don't belong. Like, it gives you a sense of how many of these men felt while they were here. We have a story that we feature, which is, so some men leave. Some men lose it. They actually, their mental health fails. And this is one story that takes place in Lethbridge of a merchant, of a fellow who was a farmer, became a merchant, and what happened to him. This is a picture many of you would have seen in the exhibition. And this is Tai Hing Gom. And I just want to read to you a little bit of what we found out about his story in the end. And the photograph of Tai Hing Gom, taken in 1924 for his Exclusion Act registration form, speaks volumes. It shows a thin, dejected-looking man in worn-out clothes who appears too broken or ashamed to look at the camera. We discovered Hing Gom's story when sifting through the CI-44 registration forms. He had arrived in Canada in 1911 at age 27 and had most likely been selected by his family or village to come to Canada because he was capable and strong. After all, between his steamship fare and head tax, it was expensive to send someone who would not be a reliable breadwinner. Between 1911 and 1923, Hing Gom worked as a laborer in various towns in BC, but mostly in the Okanagan Valley. On July 3rd, 1923, so 11 days after the Exclusion Act goes in, Hing Gom, now aged 41, suddenly broke down. He was discovered in Victoria, BC, standing on the CPR dock, crying and shouting. In his poor English, he explained he was being called to return to China. But the men who were with him, he said, had disappeared into the sky. Apprehended by the police and quickly assessed by a medical team, Hing Gom was deemed to be unsound of mind. He was shipped to Essendale Hospital, a psychiatric institution located east of Vancouver. Arriving on July 13th, he would be one of several Chinese men admitted in the months leading up to the Exclusion Act registration deadline of June 30th. All were laborers. His hospital records described him as quiet in manner and cooperative, but at times talkative and excitable. Although he tried to communicate in his imperfect English, hospital staff could barely understand him, and they never bothered to get a translator. As a result, his file reveals little about him before the breakdown. He eventually went to work in the plant nursery. Hingam never left Essendale. He would die there of tuberculosis in October of 1939, more than 16 years after he first arrived. Due to his tuberculosis, he spent the last few days segregated and alone. He was buried in the hospital cemetery. There was no record of him ever having had a visitor. Interestingly, a few years earlier in 1935, about 25 other Chinese patients at Essendale were forcibly deported to China. It was the height of the Great Depression, and governments were tired of footing the bill to house these broken men. Yet for several of these patients, the hospital had no information on where in China they were from. In fact, many of those forms talked about that they knew nothing about the person and that some of them had not spoken in all the time they had been at Essendale. But it's interesting to note how many came in that 1 year. It's like they had lived here often 10, 20, 30 years and got through it despite living in poverty, eking out a living, missing family, not having money to return home. But it's the Exclusion Act that takes them to their knees. And then, of course, there are those who made the ultimate decision, which was to take their lives. And this is where we found several of these stories, usually in newspapers, of men across the country, but predominantly in British Columbia, who end their lives in that period of time. So there's more stories in that area, but it's for us to remember that some people paid a very, very high price for that act, but they have no one to remember that they even existed. So we have this chance to remember they were here. The vast majority, the heart of the book, though, is really on the survivors. And we call them our plum blossoms. Many of you were here. Remember, we had a statement on the wall about plum blossoms, and in Chinese culture, how it's known as the flower that flowers first and survives the harsh cold of winter. So we felt that was an apt description of these people. And so in the book, we look at marriages of different types, mixed-race marriages. We look at marriages where a woman who's Canadian-born loses her Canadianness by marrying. We also look at we found a number of stories of women who were forced to marry. They were Canadian-born girls, but forced to marry immigrant men, especially after exclusion comes in, and this is a story of one woman who tries to get out of it, and you'll see there's all these newspaper headlines behind her, how she was sold, and she tried to get out of that. We also look at different family tragedies. So families are rare. Obviously, we only have 1,300 women, adult females. Families are rare, and as many of you remember, we look at what happens when the wife dies and there's no one to replace her. Another story of a woman who winds up having to take care of her children. A family where both parents die within 3 years of each other, and the catastrophic effect that has with the older daughter having to assume the role of being the parent at 18. And we talk about how they did survive. So it's really interesting because the bachelor men actually wind up playing a very important role in their lives. And we look at a story, so this is the Ko family. He seems to have everything going for him. He's got 10 children, he has a wife, he has a business. And we look at happens because he loses half of his children in a number, like 7 years, and then his wife dies. And of those remaining children, 5 children, 4 of them wind up serving in the Canadian Army. All of them had CI-45 immigration cards. We look at various stories of rejection and racism from this fellow who had to sit on the back of the bus and worked in construction and was bullied constantly because he was Chinese, the only Chinese on the crew, to Bill and Jack Wong, who ran modernized tailors here, and how a degree means nothing. We look at stories from small towns, too, and this is from Gleason, Alberta, of a fellow who was very sick, and no white doctor would treat him. So he ends up being actually nursed back to health by the indigenous band that's right next door to the city. And he actually learned how to speak their language and was just really affected and a keen supporter of their community. We also discovered, though, that racism can come in really subtle forms. And this is a memory. Sometimes racism expressed itself in subtle ways that could still humiliate and sting. Suhu Dang was the mother of 7 children and helped at her husband's tailor shop in Vancouver's downtown east side. In the neighborhood was a large, bustling department store called Woodward's, a landmark in the city. Joe Dang, one of Suhu's sons, remembers, quote, "There are vivid recollections in my mind as a youngster and still clinging onto mother's skirt as she tried, in vain, waiting in a shopping crowd for someone to serve her at a counter in the Woodward's department store. She was constantly bypassed until there was almost no one left. Race discrimination was very prevalent, and the sight of her vainly trying to attract the attention of clerks as they continued to ignore her was devastating and disheartening. The sadness still lingers in my heart as many of these instances are flashing back the thoughts of the shabby second-class treatment endured by my mother and father." And I remember him, he was so full of bravado until he told me this story. And he started to weep. And you could really, he's remembering it as a young kid, but very powerful. And it's something subtle, but nevertheless there. We also look at stories that look at poverty and also the Great Depression. We have to remember the Great Depression happened on top of all of this too. And so some of them are funny, like the woman who winds up killing a skunk in order to feed her family because there's no aid at the time, to just also other acts of generosity and how people eked out a living at that time. We also have several stories of those who adapted, like the story of Dan Lee in Owen Sound, who desperately wanted to fit in. And so he moved there as a young kid, and he learned to speak English at a time when there weren't really English courses, and he learns to ice fish and how to pull maple syrup, and he just wants to be like everybody else. Another adaptation story is this man who lived so frugally, but he, in fact, died with a lot of people owing him money, but it's quite humorous, some of the aspects. It was called Tight-Fisted Lum. We also look at a woman who ran some of her own businesses, but where she really made her money was in gambling, and gambling was such a popular pastime, and Wang Yangfeng actually wound up having like 7 fur coats in the end. We also have the descendant of this family, the Kongs. So Tom Kong ran a restaurant, but it wasn't making enough money, and there was wind up being 10 kids, 9 kids, 13 kids. So his wife one day sees a circus performance and says, well, how hard can that be? Look, I got all these kids. And she wound up creating the Kong acrobats, and they did really well. They even traveled in the US, and poor Tom had to run the restaurant by himself. And this fellow, I won't tell you the details, but he hid $1,900 in his underwear. And you can think of all that currency and what that would be like, and the reason he did that. And then we also look at those who were really brave and fought back, including Carol Lee and Walt's grandfather, who took on the system and actually sued a white family for killing his cousin, to someone like Ma Bing, who was called the Potato Baron, and really took on the Potato Control Board. There was a lot of racism towards farmers in those days, especially by the large control boards that controlled, goods. To this guy, who is Wang Jimgoon. I just want to read you a little bit about him. He was known as the King of Thugs. And for several decades, Wang Jimgoon lived up to his fearsome reputation. However, the Chinese Exclusion Act led this hardened criminal to change his ways. Jimgoon's early life in North America remained shrouded in mystery and contradiction. The story passed down is that he first immigrated to San Francisco around 1878 and worked as a houseboy in the home of a white lawyer. There, Jimgoon picked up much of his knowledge about American legal system and developed a mind for law that would serve him years later. In 1913, we find him living in Canada. In Vancouver, he established a protection society for the Wang clan. It was membership-driven. It served as a squad that would offer protection, settle scores, and influence decisions on behalf of its members. Over the next few years, Jimgoon's name begins to appear in local English and Chinese newspaper stories. Goon was arrested for a shooting, for assault and gambling, for using and selling opium, and even for holding a young white woman, a virtual prisoner, for the purpose of prostitution. Yet something changed for Jimgoon as the rumors of the Chinese exclusion law slowly became reality. Unlike his previous endeavors, the former thug changed course and threw his energy into protecting the community in a positive way. In 1923, Jimgoon helped establish a new Wang organization, the Wang Kong Har Tong Benevolent Society. We call it now the Wang's Benevolent Society, which would provide charity, support, schooling, and legal and banking services to its members. In the new role, he frequently served as an interpreter and a behind-the-scenes legal strategist. He worked alongside white lawyers who had been hired by the society to take on cases on behalf of the community. He was the legal mind behind several high-profile cases in the 20s and 30s. By the time of his death, in 1946, Jimgoon had redeemed himself in the eyes of the Chinese Canadian community. He had become a respected elder. When he died, his funeral took almost a month to organize and involved 80 vehicles in a procession more than a mile long. This is, again, thank God for newspapers, because this is a story that Andrew found in the newspaper. The Exodus. For many Chinese in Canada, the long years of separation, longing, worrying, and waiting finally came to an end in 1946. The Second World War was over. Travel between North America and China had been restored. The Exclusion Act had not yet been repealed. In early December 1946, newspaper stories in both the English and Chinese media reported that hundreds of Chinese men from across the country were making the journey back to China. Some were only going for a visit. Others were going home to live out their final years of life. 3 men never made it. They died waiting with all their worldly possessions packed, their voyage delayed due to a maritime strike in the United States. Canadian historian and author Pierre Burton was at the train station in Vancouver to witness the Exodus. He spoke to some of the travelers and described what he heard. Quote, "Many of the older ones will not return. They are too old to work, too sick in many cases to care. Their life in Canada without a family has been a lonely one. Thwarted by an 8-year war from making the trip they desired long ago, their only wish now is to get back to the country of their birth." Close quote. The elderly men returning that day were like plum blossoms, the only flower able to survive the harsh cold of winter. Like that winter flower, they had made it through the most miserable of times. Standing in their weary queues, grasping their few belongings, harboring their memories and hopes, they had endured the long, dark winter of exclusion. They had survived. Okay, I'm running short on time here, so the fourth chapter is really looking at the pivotal moment that starts to change everything, which is actually the Second World War. Who knew that something so disastrous could be what was the beginning of the change for the Chinese Canadian community? So we look at a number of men and women who served in uniform or in ammunitions or on the home front. We look at how, for some of the men, when the war was over, no troop ship came to get them. They were on their own, and they were told to find their way back to Canada. And they had to flag down cargo ships and offer to work as deckhands in order to get back home. We look at a few of those whose lives ended because of that war. And this is a story of a mother who's this is a newspaper headline. She's Mrs. Hong. She's encouraging other people to buy war bonds. Her first son, Joseph, she gets a telegram in May 1944 that he's died in a plane crash. And 4 months later, she gets another message. The start of the Second World War in 1939 would sow the first seeds of change for Chinese in Canada. For some Chinese Canadian families, the war would bring unbearable heartache and loss. We know of at least 9 young Canadian-born Chinese men, all in their early 20s and all at the beginning of their life's journey, who would never live to celebrate the end of the war. For their immigrant parents, losing a child to a country that had so discriminated against and vilified their community likely made the loss even greater and the wound deeper. Added to their pain was the realization that their children's bodies would never be returned to Canada. Their grieving mothers and fathers would never have the opportunity or the means to visit their sons' graves in Europe. At the end of the Second World War, the Chinese community could proudly look back knowing they had done their part. We had purchased large numbers of victory bonds. We had helped build the aircrafts and the ships and helped make the ammunition needed for the battlefront. They had recycled their metals and rubber. They had patrolled neighborhoods, watched over sea lanes. Most importantly, their sons and daughters had served the country with distinction. And for a brief period, Chinese Canadians felt accepted. And this is an interesting quote we pulled, because it says, when he put on the soldier's uniform for the first time, he felt like a free man. Before that, he told me he woke up every day like someone was physically kneeling on his chest, like a crushed person who couldn't dream of being free. And I think even in that little quote, which is by his daughter, speaking of Alex Louis, that it reveals something about what that experience was like before. And the last chapter, called From the Ashes of Exclusion, really looks at what happens at the end of this journey. We look at the fight for repeal, how that took place, who led it. We also look at the forever bachelors. So this is the consequent, even though it's over, there's still these remnants of it that continue on for several decades afterwards. One are what we call the forever bachelors, which were the men that never returned home and never were able to reunite with their families. And we look at the reasons that some of them were like that. But what's interesting is, I want to just say something about Larry Wong in this picture. So this photo from Lori is a beautiful photo of this bachelor man looking onto these children. And you have to remember, some of these men have been here, and Larry used to tell me how when he was growing up, the little girls would sometimes walk by these old bachelor men, and the old bachelors would look at them. And the girls would go, ooh, like, why are these old men looking at us? It could be little boys too. And Larry explained to me that it was because there was like this longing, like this life they never had, or the children that they never were able to grow up, see and be with. And he said it was actually a longing for that. And looking at these children in some ways reminded them of everything that they had been denied. We also look at how many of these men here took on the role of uncles. They were called uncles. Often we don't know their names, but there are an array of pictures and memories that people shared with us of these men. And they're really, really sweet. They're often about food, which is interesting. And the final part of this chapter is to look at the long road to reunion, so that even though it's over, again, the aftermath is still there. The aftermath of children meeting a very elderly father. That little girl there, her father is that very old man who came to Canada this age, and by the time he finally has a family and is with them, is this very elderly, frail man who doesn't last very long. Or others who the separation has been so long that they cannot bring themselves to call their father, father. They're strangers. We look at some other ones too. Again, I'm running over here, so it's just of a man who he and his wife adopted a child, and then when he applies, he's told, no, the adopted child can't come. And then his wife says, well, then I'm not coming either. I'm sorry, but you're on your own. And we have the letter where he's pleading for them to understand. And then another story, Wong Yu and Gi, which is really of a guy who for 50 years was here on his own. And finally, his wife comes. He does all the paperwork, takes a while to bring her here. And she arrives in March, and he passes away in April. And lastly, we close off this chapter by looking at those who lived long enough to become what we call the redress warriors, those who were helping to front and support the work for the head tax redress. And what's interesting, though, is when we looked at the speech by Stephen Harper in 2006, when he offers the apology and the compensation, is that there's little mention made of the Exclusion Act. And yet, it was actually far worse than the period of the head tax, much more devastating to the community. I want to go back to this notion of silence. So we close the book with remembrance. Remembrance requires something to remember. But what if we don't know what we should remember? What happens when silence extinguishes memory? The paper trail has taught us that silence speaks volumes, and out of silence can emerge whispers from the past. We need only listen. Through this 100th anniversary commemoration, we learned how early Chinese Canadians buried the pain and humiliation of the exclusion years by staying silent. The consequence was that within a single generation, memory was lost, and a monumental chapter in the history of one community had all but disappeared. For me, and for hundreds of other descendants of early Chinese Canadians, unearthing these buried voices has been deeply rewarding and emotional. and has fundamentally changed who we are and how we connect to our past. The process of discovery has led us to feel both great empathy for those who went before us and a sense of debt and gratitude to them. At the same time, we have awakened strong pride in the Chinese community's ability to endure, to overcome, and ultimately to flourish. For many of us, the project has inspired an interest in uncovering our family history. For others, buried memories have been revived. Understanding has been deepened. Some have recalled the elderly Chinese bachelors they once knew and, for the first time, have reflected on the price some people paid for exclusion. We have come to recognize that for some Chinese men, exclusion was a life sentence. We have started to appreciate how much exclusion shaped our parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, and how it shaped us, the generations born after exclusion. We now realize how the scars were revealed through reprimands and exhortations like learn to speak perfect English, keep your head down, try to blend in, get a practical education, leave Chinatown. We also discovered that the very documents our community once despised can hold new meaning for us today. The silver lining to the government-issued CI certificates is that today they are the remnants that help us fill the void left by silence. In the absence of having our stories passed on directly, these fragile pieces of paper provide a glimpse and a profile of our past. The mugshot portraits attached to those certificates have left many of us with the only photographic record of some ancestors. Ironically, the paper trail of CI certificates has humanized our history, provided faces to names, and unlocked stories. Unfortunately, Canada's past cannot be changed. Only our present and our future can be shaped by the lessons we glean from the mistakes we made as a country and as a community. After all we have learned, we must not go back to being silent. It is now the duty of a new generation to pass on to future generations all that we have discovered and felt and remembered. Thank you.
I want to introduce and welcome Fiona Tinway Lam to the stage here. Just a quick introduction. Fiona was the past Vancouver Poet Laureate here in the city of Vancouver and is the author of 3 books of poetry, Intimate Distances, Ode to Laments, and Enter the Chrysanthemum. And Fiona has a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing, a Master of Laws, and a Bachelor, and of course, Bachelor of Laws as well. Very accomplished, and a friend to the community and the Asian Canadian literary community. So welcome, Fiona.
Such a pleasure and honor to be here today and see so many faces here. Who among you here saw the wonderful paper trail exhibit? Okay, so many of you. Well, if you didn't get a chance to see that fabulous, fabulous exhibit, I saw it 3 times and wanted to see it more. And now I get a chance to, because if you haven't seen the exhibit, you can now see the book, which is fabulous as well and contains even more information. Such an impressive undertaking coming at a time when we experienced with the COVID pandemic, incredible scourge of anti-Asian racism. It was very timely to have this incredible exhibit at this wonderful museum, this incredible space that provided us a chance to see our Chinese Canadian history portrayed in such depth with those personal stories unearthed so that we could connect to them. Now, there's other ways of connecting to the past, and that is through poetry, in fact. So during the last few months of my 3-year tenure as Vancouver's Poet Laureate last fall, I was so honored to be asked to play a very small role in assisting the Chinese Canadian Museum in setting up the Echoes of Exclusion Poetry Contest to commemorate the Paper Trail exhibit. So this was a very special contest for poets and would-be poets of all ages and abilities to submit their original unpublished poems that would relate in a meaningful way to the Chinese Exclusion Act and contribute to the understanding of the Act's effects and impacts. So poems can be stories too. They can provide a window into the past, allowing us to connect deeply to the emotions, experiences, and memories of past generations, thereby bringing history to life. So in the Paper Trail exhibit, Catherine found this incredible poem from 1923 that was published way back then, and it's called Never Forget July 1st. If you have the book, it's on page 229, and it distills that sense of agony and outrage at Humiliation Day and the passage of the Exclusion Act. So that poem, and also we did a creative writing poetry workshop on the Exclusion Act in conjunction with the exhibit, was a springboard for the poets to try to put themselves in the shoes of those who suffered the impact of the Exclusion Act. So there were 3 categories. There was youth, so grade 12 or under. There was adult, and there was senior, 65 or over. And there were 3 judges. There was Yao Sweden Zhao, a Chinese Canadian community researcher and lecturer at UBC, Catherine Clement, of course, and myself. And poems were judged on the following criteria. They had to convey a deep and real understanding of the impact of the Chinese Exclusion Act. They had to demonstrate the skillful and effective use of imagery, language, and metaphor. They had to avoid cliches. In other words, they had to use fresh and original metaphors, images, language, and approaches. And they had to be under 250 words. Not too long. Actually, the more you compress and distill, you get just the right word. So the grand prize was $300 for each of the 3 categories, and including, most importantly, publication in the Paper Trail book. So you'll find the winning poems in the back of the book. The runners-up also received $100 and a copy of a book by poet Christopher C., A Song for Paper Children. The winners also received an annual membership for the Chinese Canadian Museum, which I think is terrific because it's a fantastic museum. I'm a member. I hope you'll become members too if you're not already, or get memberships for your family members and friends. So on behalf of the other judges and organizers, I want to congratulate the winning and shortlisted poets whose winning poems appear in the book. And I also want to introduce each of the 3 winning poets in turn, who will be giving either a live reading or a video recorded reading. So we'll start with the youth category. The winner is a very talented young poet, Isabel Hernandez Chang. Her poem, July 1st, Eyes Wide Open. And she's here with us today. She's a grade 11 student who just finished grade 11 at York House School, who is passionate, absolutely passionate about language, arts, fencing, and classical music. Since she was little, she's been an avid fan of all things poetry. And the judges, we looked at that poem, which is on page 230. This wonderful poem was written in the persona and point of view of a Chinese worker struggling to cope with a long separation from his family. It powerfully depicts his despair and hopelessness. So please welcome Isabel to the stage.
This is July 1st, Eyes Wide Open. There was something about Dominion Day, July 1st, 1923. But then there was also knowing that I'd never see them again. Here are 2 things that I know. 1, an empty room is so much more when I've closed my eyes. It's utterly desperate and pathetic to find myself in the sordidness of this room. She's there. I can imagine her laughter, her touch, the way her sharp brown eyes crinkle when she smiles. Her shadow, that's somewhere in China, is in this room also. This wintry room is warm and lit. The sun can only illuminate half the earth at a time, yet she can burn her fire for me from the other half. And two, an empty room is just an empty room when I've opened my eyes. I arrived by ship, 1919. Everything we had gone to head tax. Promised my wife and mom and dad that I'd labor away at the cannery, earn enough to pay for them too, so that they could live in this land of feigned freedom over exploitation and false opportunity. Listen, I'll endure it. Bleary, exhausted, muscle-aching, cultural shame, never enough. Never going to prove myself. July 1st, 1923. My suffering has been futile. No chance, no shining beacon, no savior, and no salvation. I shut my eyes and I can't see them in this room. This was the beginning of the Chinese Exclusion Act. This was the end of everything. Thank you so much.
Excellent reading, Isabel. It's incredible when we can create this bridge across decades between history and the present this way and connect to those emotions and feelings. And this book has been amazing in opening a portal to making those connections between generations. Thank you so much, Catherine, for making space for poetry and for writers. In the adult category, we have April Liu, who won for her poem, A Daughter in the Shadows, Guangzhou, 1938. We'll have a video recording of her reading her poem. April Liu is a curator, author, and a cultural programmer who is passionate about sharing stories of Chinese Canadian history and heritage. She was formerly the manager of public programs and education at the Chinatown Storytelling Center in Vancouver, BC. You can find her poem on page 231. This very poignant poem is written from the perspective of a child and their mother left behind in China during wartime.
Hi, my name is April Liu, and I'm pleased to be sharing a poem with you today. First, I'd like to thank the Chinese Canadian Museum and Catherine Clement and everyone who worked on that incredible exhibition, The Paper Trail. And congratulations on this wonderful publication. I'm truly honored to be a part of it. The title of my poem is A Daughter in the Shadows, Guangzhou, 1938. And I'd like to dedicate it to my great-grandmother, who was the only family member who couldn't leave when everyone else fled the war. When I think of her, I think of all the women, the grandmothers, the mothers and daughters, who were separated from their families and whose stories we have yet to hear. This poem is for all of you. A Daughter in the Shadows, Guangzhou, 1938. We crouch beneath the mulberry tree, leaves fluttering nervous whispers. The firebird's song, a shriek of metal blossoms, bursts through the darkened skyline. Mother grips my arm, her voice a taut wire. Don't look up. Go inside. We hunch around a sweating flame, praying for Father's letter from Saltwater City, a place so far the words are scribbled on tissue to be cheap and light as air. He's alive, but can't send money, she murmurs. Her bony frame bent across the window to keep the sky from collapsing in. Father, a ghost in the photograph, creased and seared by sun, is speechless. As our world convulsed, as I lost the contours of his face. Such was our sentence, enforced by foreign laws that scorned our celestial features. our family bonds, our right to exist. The Chinese Exclusion Act would be a slow, interminable burn, a summary execution of my family. No trial, no last words. Amid furious streaks of light, she cut my hair and put me in boys' clothes. The ancient city smolders under Japanese fire. I squeeze her hand, the warmth slipping away. A mirage in the scorching iron rain.
Yes, a very powerful poem about those left behind in China. Finally, in the over 65 category, the winning poet is Fengling Feimo, and her poem is Year 101, and we have a recording of her reading her video, with the poem on video. Fengling Feimo is an arts and culture advocate in the Calgary community. She is an engaged community member of the Calgary Chinatown and advised on the cultural plan and area redevelopment plan. Recent projects include establishing a community collection at the City of Calgary Archives to preserve Chinese Canadian heritage assets, and she does research consulting for Heritage Park. So you can find her poem on page 232. This poem is what we call an ekphrastic poem. It's a poem inspired by a photograph or artwork. And the photograph is of a lonely Chinese man wearing a fedora type of hat. And it's a kind of poetic address to this man, depicting his loneliness, desolation, and broken dreams. And here's the video.
Year 101. For the man in the fedora. For all the bachelors and the families that never were. No memories nearby. I never knew his name, nor the people he had to forget. Bid farewell to father, mother, wife. I never knew his name, nor the CI numbers and burden he was forced to carry. Calling bingo numbers 5, man alive, 9, doctor's orders, 28, in a state, 36, 3 dozen, 45, halfway there. Year 101 came too late for the last bachelor, defeated by time and more. Loose face, dreams of Gamsan Ha became Abba instead. Crumpled pieces of CI certificates matching crumpled dignities, crumpled dreams. Reduced the bingo numbers. No one to tell his story, no one to visit his gravesite, no one to picnic with him come tomb sweeping days. Solitary. In a suit and fedora. Perched at Chinatown street corners, smoking a cigarette, head bowed, no gaze, shadow confined to the brick wall, edged, never left, mokgo, pig pens, fenced in, guilt, guilty of what? Never left. Desolation. Caged on that island. Stayed. I never knew his name. For the man in the fedora.
So I just want to wrap up by thanking Catherine and thanking the team at the Chinese Canadian Museum for giving voice, essential voice, to those whose voices have not been heard, unburying them, letting those invisible scars be seen and to heal, giving voice to the injustice, the loneliness, the fear, the isolation, the outrage, the frustration, and also to the chance to recognize and acknowledge the trials and tribulations of those in our community that we now can honor again. So thank you again for all coming out.
Actually, before we do Q&A, I just want to acknowledge a couple of people in the room who were really very instrumental to helping me on this project. One in the back there, with their head down, is June Chow, who took on all the work regarding with the archive. So the two legacies of this project are, one, the book, but it is the digital collection at UBC, which is available online, that has all the CI certificates scanned front and back, as well as the biographies that were submitted for every one of the people who carried the burden of those documents. June is the one that pulled that together. And she also pulled together the records, the submissions that were related to the head tax redress. So all the applications that came in for head tax redress, which also has some background information, are also available at UBC as part of the paper trail collection. Those are not digitized, but there's still an interesting body of records that will be useful well into the future. So thank you, June, so much. And I think I have the wrong glasses on today. I think I see Christina Laszlo, who it was really wonderful. She's the head of UBC Library Rare Books and Special Collections, and she's the one that graciously accepted all our records in there for all time. And I'm really, just a community person coming up to you, right? You usually do things for the university, but was really great at being the keeper, agreeing to be the keeper of all these records so they would be accessible. I have one other person I want to thank, and that's this little person here. Come up, Naomi. So Naomi was... I like it because she's smaller than me, so
that's why you picked me.
That's why I picked you. Naomi she worked on the project with me from the beginning, although I really didn't get to know her until about, I guess, a year and a half into the project. And she was finishing up her master's, and I was like going nuts trying to get ready for the exhibition, which was, I'd heard we're going to be in this space, and she was marvelous. She stuck with me since then. Many of you have met her. She did a lot of research for you and looking through the newly released records. And I don't know if you want to, she's just about to go off to NYU to do a PhD on this topic and comparing it with American experience. But this is your last chance if you want to say, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you want to just say a couple of words.
Sure. Like I think many of you in this room, I was brought here to the museum in part because of Catherine's immense generosity and just capacity for so much. I met many of you while I was doing research here, and I've had just such a special time, and it has only been in part thanks to Catherine and the immense amount of community support that the paper trail has enjoyed. None of it would really be possible without such an amazing community response. And it's just given me so much. It's changed my life forever, and I cannot say enough good things about Catherine and so many of you and my time here. So thank you, and a big thank you to Catherine for everything.
So I don't think so. I have never worked on something so painful in my whole life. And, those who were close, that we were working together, some of the things we saw and read that are actually not in the book and never appeared in the exhibition were heartbreaking. And I would put myself into someone else's shoes, like my grandfather, and imagine reading this or hearing this and what that would have been like. I understand. I think, as someone said to me more recently, they didn't tell us because in some ways it wasn't just wanting to blend in, but it was that generation didn't want to tell us because they didn't want to burden us with that same monkey on our back. And they wanted to, it was an act of love to not tell us, because otherwise we would be saddled with that same bloody insecurity and humiliation or shame or whatever it was. And so they kind of tried to break that bond. And I guess I'm grateful to them for that too, although it made it a lot of work to do this project, of course. So, well, I think telling your children about this is the start of it. And that's why I said at in the end, it's up now that we know this, now that we've uncovered this and excavated this, it's up to us to make sure it never goes silent again and that we don't lose this. I find it, the irony is that in so many other communities, they do know about their history. So in the Black Americans and slavery, and the indigenous community about the residential school system, even in the Japanese community, there's a real awareness of internment in the war. And yet we really lost ours, to the point that all these years that I was interviewing people, it never, ever came up. And I was interviewing people in their 80s and 90s who lived through this. So that's why I'm hoping with this book that it'll become part of your archive. You put your other personal, records there of your grandfathers and grandmothers all in one little box, and it becomes part of the whole transfer of knowledge and transfer of archival material to the next generation. Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much, all of you, and all who contributed to this. Thank you. I could have not have done this without everybody. Thank you.